Okay, so we're going to start talking about Buddhist ethics with this video, and we're going to divide this dimension up into two different videos because we have a couple of important topics to cover within this dimension. So to start with, we'll just go over a couple of basics in terms of the outlook of Buddhist ethics in general. And one thing to note is that Buddhist ethics focus on motivation. So the idea in Buddhism is that what we really want to do is we want to cultivate compassion. We want to cultivate compassion for all sentient beings, beings that are trapped in samsara with us, like ourselves, so humans and animals. So a sentient being for Buddhism is a human or an animal. And the idea is that if we cultivate this compassionate motivation, we don't have to worry so much about the actual action, what ends up being the result in the world. Because as long as our motivation was pure, as long as our motivation was compassion and love and kindness, then in terms of karma, it doesn't actually matter what happens with our action. And this just is sort of taking into account that sometimes we try to do good things, sometimes we try to do an act of kindness or an act of generosity, but we end up offending someone, we end up saying the wrong thing, we end up doing the wrong thing, and it actually ends up hurting someone. But we didn't mean to, we weren't meaning to, right? Our hearts were in the right place, our motivation was in the right place. So in Buddhism, the emphasis is not so much on what the result of our action is, so much as why we did that action. And the motivation that we want, as I mentioned, is compassion. And that really goes back to this idea that we are all trapped in samsara together. Right? If we are all, we're all in the same cycle of life, death, and rebirth. And remember, the mark of samsara is suffering, right? Hinduism and Buddhism teach us this. To be alive, to exist in samsara, means that every single lifetime, no matter what form, no matter what gender, no matter the other circumstances of that life, is ultimately marked by more suffering than joy. So we should be compassionate towards others because everyone is suffering, right? Everyone is stuck in this place with us. They are all going through their own forms of suffering. Everyone is suffering in their own ways. So we should be sympathetic, right? We should be compassionate to that and try not to add to anyone's suffering because we know that they're already suffering enough, right? To simply exist here means that you have to live through some pretty hard things. So that's one of the ideas behind cultivating this compassionate motivation. The other one is that because of reincarnation, we should keep in mind that everyone, every living being that we come in contact with has already lived, many hundreds, if not thousands of lifetimes before this point. So just because when I come into contact with someone in this lifetime, our relationship may be, acquaintances, we may be strangers, we may just have a very casual or loose or brief connection in this lifetime, that I should remember that because there are so many lifetimes that we all go through, every single individual that I come across has likely been or will be in the future the closest thing to me, right? In this lifetime, this person, that I bumped into, this is an acquaintance, someone I don't know that well, but in a previous lifetime, that individual could have been my mother or my father, my husband or my wife, my child, my best friend, my sibling. And if they haven't in the past, they will very likely be in the future. So when we see someone, when we meet someone, we have an encounter with someone, we should remember that, right? We should remember that that individual was probably one of the most intimate connections to us. So we should treat that individual as such, right? I should treat that individual with respect and care because the connection that we have in this lifetime, that's just this lifetime, right? That's just temporary. So that person must have been, through the countless number of lives that we all live, sometime in the past or sometime in the future, that individual is going to be someone who's very close to me. So I should treat them as such. I should remember that in my treatment of them. So those are kind of some of the two core reasons for developing that compassionate motivation, right? And then as long as what I'm always trying to do is show compassion to people, it doesn't matter so much in terms of earning good karma, whether or not my actions end up, being well received by that individual, let's say, or, if I accidentally say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, I shouldn't worry too much about that because I know that I was trying to behave kindly and with compassion. Then another just sort of general idea to remember is that Buddhism, kind of similar to Hinduism, doesn't necessarily categorize actions as like good or bad, right? This is a good thing to do or a bad thing to do in terms of like this is good versus evil. Actions are actions, and so they are usually categorized more as efficient or inefficient actions because of karma, right? Remember that within Buddhism, again, similar to Hinduism, we are trapped in samsara and we are going to live lifetime after lifetime after lifetime until we overcome our attachment, we learn to see the world for what it really is, we become enlightened, and we achieve nirvana. So every action that I do is either getting me closer to that result or it's moving me farther away from that result or that goal. So if I do something that's moving me farther away, it's not necessarily that it's bad or that it's evil, but it's really inefficient because I'm going to have to do the hard work to overcome that, right? If I'm doing something that's hurting another individual, if I'm being selfish, if I'm being careless, all I'm doing is hurting myself, right? Because I am then creating bad karma, and it's something that I'll have to make up for eventually, right? It will put me back in my path, and I'm going to have to do more work, more compassionate work, and work on myself to overcome those actions. So usually in Buddhism, you don't necessarily hear vocabulary as much about like good and evil in terms of what we do in this world, but it's more about, well, is this bringing you closer to your goal? From this action, are you gaining greater clarity about the world, greater understanding, or is it confusing you? Is it sort of helping you to, stay within this world of attachment? So that's usually how actions are discussed and classified in Buddhism, as opposed to like good and bad, sin and not sin, something like that. So now we're gonna move on. We're gonna do one more slide for this video talking about ethics, and the next thing that we're going to go over are what are called the 5 precepts in Buddhism. So Buddhism does have a list of rules. So on the one hand, it has an approach to ethics that's more motivation centered, but there is this list of things that you should avoid doing. And you'll notice as we go through them that they're you could say very standard, something familiar, something similar to other commandment style rules in other religious traditions, that are a guidance for behavior, for what Buddhists are encouraged to do or to not do. So the first one is to abstain from taking life. So you should not kill a living being. And this includes in Buddhism humans and animals, right? Because it's the same sort of worldview that we saw in Hinduism, and that we are on the same level as animals because we have karmic results. Both humans and animals are trapped in this karmic cycle of samsara. So you don't want to take a human life or an animal life that's seen as equal. And most Buddhists, because of this, try to follow a vegetarian diet. Just like in Hinduism, it doesn't mean that everyone's perfect about it, but that is the encouragement, that it is better to eat vegetarian, to avoid eating meat-eating animals. The second precept is to abstain from taking what is not given. So this has to do with not stealing, not being greedy, right? Only take what is given to you. Don't take or don't steal from someone else. The third one is to abstain from sexual misconduct, and this is usually interpreted as a pretty standard orthodox way, which is that sexual relations are only appropriate within the confines of marriage or a serious monogamous relationship. So those are actions that you would want to avoid. The fourth one is to abstain from false speech, and this definitely refers to lying. So you don't want to say things that aren't true. And generally, it's also expanded to mean that you don't want to use your speech for malicious purposes, right? If you're trying to cultivate compassionate motivations, you don't want to use your speech to harm someone else. So you don't want to say untrue things about people. You also don't want to say cruel or insulting things, and you don't want to gossip about people. So don't use your speech for malicious purposes. And then the last one is to abstain from intoxicants that cause heedlessness. So this could refer to drugs or alcohol, but the second part of this here, that cause heedlessness, means that for that individual has to decide what intoxicants cause heedlessness for him or her. So in general, this is understood to mean no drugs, but it's not necessarily meant to include alcohol. Most Buddhist countries or most Buddhists do not abstain from drinking alcohol, but they would want to abstain from drinking alcohol to the extent that it causes heedlessness, right? If the goal of Buddhism is to wake up in the sense of seeing the world for what it truly is, understanding the true nature of reality, we don't want to take intoxicants that cause our vision and our understanding of reality to be further clouded. So intoxicants such as alcohol are appropriate to the extent that the individual can handle them, they can control themselves, and it's not causing heedlessness for that individual. So those are the 5 precepts. As I said, they're seen as 5 general guidelines for behavior within Buddhism, and they're pretty standard. They're pretty common to what you would see in other religious traditions. But one thing that is unique about them is that technically they are considered voluntary. So becoming a Buddhist or being Buddhist doesn't necessarily mean that you automatically are expected to follow all 5 of these. They are supposed to be taken on by the individual as that person feels ready to take them on. So they are voluntary. So, you could say that, I'm ready to follow like the first 3. I'm volunteering to take those on, but I'm not quite ready to follow the last 2. Those are ones that I hope to be ready to follow at a certain point in the future, but maybe not yet. So they are considered voluntary, and that you decide when you are capable of following these rules and taking these on. Another thing that's important to note is that remember that Buddhism teaches non-attachment, right? That as we go through the world, as we go through life, we want to avoid becoming attached to things, right? That clinging, that tanha from the 4 Noble Truths, because it's that clinging that causes suffering, right? Because everything changes. So because of that in Buddhism, it's important to remember that we also don't want to become attached to these rules. So the 5 precepts are there. They are important. They are, crucial guidelines for behavior. But the idea in Buddhism is that you still should not become attached to these rules, because there will be times in your life when the more compassionate choice is to break these rules. So really that emphasis on compassionate motivation overrides everything. And so we have to be ready to detach from these rules in order to be compassionate. That sometimes that's necessary. So you could think of, for example, these rules shouldn't be clung to by someone who is using them to divide people or judge people, right? If someone is following all 5 of these precepts, and notices that someone else in their community is not following them, that person might judge that person and say, oh, I'm a better Buddhist than that person because I can follow all 5 precepts, but that other person doesn't. In that instance, the 5 precepts are not being used to generate good behavior, right? To generate compassion. In that instance, that individual is using the precepts as a means for judgment, right? To engage in false speech. So at that point, they're not working, right? They're not working for that individual, and that person needs to detach from these rules. Another example would be, if you remember, the death of the Buddha. Remember, the Buddha, when he died, it was from eating bad meat. He accepted a dish from a farmer that he was staying with. The meat had gone bad, and he contracted food poisoning from it. In that moment, right, even though the Buddha did normally follow a vegetarian diet, he broke that rule, right? He broke from the first precept, or at least eating something that was from a life that was taken, because it was the more compassionate choice, right? That individual had offered him that food that had cost a lot of money and spent a lot of time to prepare. So his goal was compassion, right? And in that moment, he wanted to show compassion to that person. So he accepted the food and he ate the food, even though that meant breaking one of the rules, because that was the more compassionate choice. So in Buddhism, there is an emphasis that you have to remember that sometimes you have to break the rules. The rules are there, they are an important guideline for our behavior, but compassion should always come first. Compassion and kindness for others. And sometimes in life, that's going to mean going against some of these precepts, going against some of these rules. Okay, so we're going to stop there for our first part of ethics, and then we're going to continue on with a second video where we're going to talk about the Noble Eightfold Path.